welcome back. Remember in the first video I said that you should wash all of your fabric as you plan on washing the quilt? Well, after you've done that, the next step is to press. As you can see I'm doing here, I'm pressing all of the fabric that I have. Um, you don't have to be fancy in pressing, just make sure you get all the wrinkles out of the garment or out of the fabric. Make sure you get all the wrinkles out of the fabric so that it can be a better way for you to cut. So the next step is to cut 81 4.5 inch by 4.5 inch squares. And then after you've cut those squares out, you can audition the layout placement on how you want it to be in your quilt, like I'm doing right here. I'm auditioning a fabric to see how I want to place it in my quilt. And once I have a pattern that I want, I am now putting together all the rows, assembling my rows, so I can know how the order I'm going to sew them in. So once you've done all of this, you should end up with 9 rows that contain 9 squares in each row. Now I'm ready to sew up my quilt. You want to sew the squares together, right sides together at 1/4 inch seam allowance. In this clip, I'm checking to make sure that I've sewn an accurate 1/4 inch seam. Looks accurate to me, so I'm just going to keep on sewing my squares up together. Remember, right sides together, 1/4 inch seam allowance. And just keep on sewing these. Remember, there's 81 squares that you'll be sewing together. In this row, oops, I made a mistake. I wanted those fish to be facing right side up, and they're the wrong way. So I'm so happy I have my seam ripper, so I'm just going to rip out the seam, and I'm just going to re-sew this. And if you have to do that, it's no problem. Just rip it out and re-sew it. It doesn't impact your quilt at all by you wanting to make it right. And just keep on going with sewing on each of your squares together. Just keep on sewing it together. You can't hear it here, but I'm actually watching TV in the background. So you may want to after you get in a rhythm of sewing, you might want to have the TV on as you're watching. You might want to listen to a podcast or listen to more YouTube videos as you're sewing this. So once you get a rhythm and you know what you're doing and you know your pattern, just find something else to do so that the process can go by faster. And before you know it, you'll have a row. Look at this. I have a row of 9 already done. So the next step is for me to press this row. I need to press this row. So as I'm pressing, I'm starting from the front. I'm just going and making sure that I'm pressing all of the seams down. Make sure they're staying flat. And this is an important step because this is going to form your quilt and you don't want it to be wrinkled. When you leave wrinkles in, it'll compromise the quilt because you won't be sewing accurate seams with wrinkled fabric. That's why I wanted you to use 100% cotton for this quilt because it's so easy to press it. And if you have any issues pressing your fabric, just use a little starch. And now I'm going to press the back. It's important that when you're pressing the seams in the back that you want to make sure they're all going in one direction. Here I'm pressing these over to the left side. So make sure all of your seams go to one side. And you want to make sure that the rows are alternating as well. So if this is row number 1, I'm pressing these seams to the left. That means I want row number 2 to be pressed to the right, row number 3 back to the left, and so on. And the reason I'm doing that is so that when I'm attaching the rows together, which is going to be the next step after sewing up the rows, you're going to have to attach those rows together. You want to nestle those seams so they're matching perfectly. Perfection is not one of the things I like to do when I'm quilting, but when you're sewing these rows, you want to get them as close to perfect as possible. Like here, you see, and in this clip here, I'm auditioning the rows. You know, we had auditioned the squares. Now I'm auditioning the rows. How do I want my rows? And here I'm actually sewing together 2 rows. I have my 2 rows sewing together. And make sure that when you're sewing your rows together that you have your seams still going in the same direction, and make sure they're laying flat. See, I'm making sure it's laying flat as I'm removing the pin. So let's watch this. I'm going to do that again for you. As I'm sewing these over, I'm making sure that the seam needs to be flat, going to the same side, the left. That's how it needs to do. It needs to go to the same side. We don't, because it's easy to mess these up when I'm stopping here again, removing my pin, and I'm sewing, making sure that seam is flat and not turned back to the wrong direction. So that's what you want to do when you're sewing these. And if yours, when you're done, you see that you've had it go to the wrong side, just use your seam ripper, take out the seam, and re-sew it again. So, but I like to take my time on the step like this because I know this is important to the construction of the quilt. So as I get to those parts with the seams, I'm going to stop and make sure that it's at the right side, and take out my pins, and I'm going to sew over those. So after you've sewn all 9 rows together, it's time to add the back fabric to the quilt. And here I'm just going to show you with a smaller version to show you how to do that. So you have your front of your fabric, which is your patchwork, and then you have the fleece, which is the back. You're going to put those two together like so, and you're going to pin around because you want to make sure that these don't shift. You want to pin around it. You're going to sew around it 1/4 of an inch, and you want to leave an opening so that you can turn the quilt. Okay, so I'm done, and you see that I've sewn around the representation I have here of a quilt, and I have my opening, and I'm going to turn it inside out now. I'm turning it right side out. I want to see the quilt. Turn the pretty side out of the quilt. Okay, so you're going to do this with your main quilt. You're going to turn it, and then I'm using a sharp object to kind of push out the corners because I want them to lay flat when I press them. And that's what you want to do. And I'm just going to go in and press. This is the representation of the quilt. I'm pressing the quilt. And I know you're wondering, what about that hole? What are we going to do with that hole that's there? So we're going to turn those seams inside of the quilt like I'm showing you, and we're going to press those down. Turn those inside. I'm pressing those down. And then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a top stitch. So I'm going to sew around the quilt one last time and at 1/4 of an inch to make sure I catch this opening. And if you want to be more decorative, you can sew around twice. You can sew once at 1/4 of an inch like I'm going to do here. And then a second time you can go back and sew it 1/8 of an inch with something decorative, just so you can catch that seam. So I'm showing you that there's the opening. Okay. And you need to make sure that's closed. So 1/4 of an inch will close that seam. But if you want to be extra secure about that seam, go back and sew it twice. And look, once you've done those steps with your main quilt, you'll be done like I'm done here. So what I'm doing on my quilt here is I am pressing it one last time. I'm going through, I'm checking to make sure that there are no loose threads. I'm cleaning it up. I'm doing all the needful things to do. I'm making sure, I just want to make sure it looks pretty, because especially if you're presenting this to somebody, you want to make sure it looks nice. But I'm also showing you that's where I turned my quilt, the seam that I need to go in, press, make sure that's pressed down. Okay, I'm pressing that seam down. And I'm going to go and I'm going to sew all around to catch that, because I want to make sure that the seam is it's closed, that I close that seam. And then after I do that, this step is done.